Welcome up! In this episode we will talk about Socrates and the problems that politics posed in his philosophy. Coming up. Hello, I'm Understanding Politics, and in this channel I explain political theories and debates to students as well as curious and passionate people, just like you. I've structured this lecture in four macro sections. In the first one we will introduce the general ideas of Socrates' philosophy. In the following ones we will explain three different Platonic dialogues: Protagoras, Gorgias and Crito. Let's dive into it. We don't know much about Socrates, and most of what we do we know through his student Plato, who unlike his master wrote books and did not practice philosophy as a simple oral exercise. Socrates did not investigate politics as much as Plato or Aristotle did, but his contribution is highly important in light of the concepts that we discussed in the previous episode on politics in ancient Greece. Politics had a noble goal in ancient Greece, but the emergence of sophists, speakers and orators more than actual philosophers, created a friction in the poleis. In fact, as we said, politics was conceived as the highest of activities and had to be guided by logos to achieve harmony and freedom. To engage in politics, a man had to be virtuous and truthful. In other words, a philosopher from the root of the term, a person that loves knowledge, Sophia. On the other hand, sophists were often discussing the validity of the concept of knowledge and truth. Socrates' whole life can be understood as a fight to re-establish the truth that sophists questioned. I talk about truth while Socrates talked about virtue. Yet, it is the idea of knowledge that opposed Socrates to the sophists. In fact, while sophists were often proposing a knowledge based on scholism and the rhetoric to be able to convince others of the validity of arguments, Socrates proposed an idea of knowledge based on competence and aware understanding of the topic in discussion. After the reforms of Clisthenes, Athens favored the emergence of sophists. But in this context, any dishonest man with charm and rhetorical skills could convince his fellow citizens to take the most dangerous decisions for his own interest. That is why, according to Socrates, virtue is fundamental, but also real knowledge is based on competence. Again, while many populist parties nowadays overstress the idea of virtue, they tend to downplay competence, a behavior that would put them in stark opposition with Socrates. As you might know, Plato's books are structured as dialogues to mirror the dialectic philosophy of Socrates based on the maieuthix, the act of giving birth to ideas through a debate. To understand politics for Socrates, we have hence to look at a few of these dialogues. The first one is Protagoras, taking the name from the homonymous sophist philosopher Protagoras. In his schools, Protagoras teaches the art of politics, suggesting that there is no other specific knowledge required when you deal with politics. Socrates dissents because when the assembly decides on specific topics, it consults professionals of different sectors, being them medical doctors or engineers, and for general policies, decisions are taken in equal measure from every free citizen. Socrates concludes that politics is not an art and cannot be taught or transmitted, presenting the case of Pericles and his children as an example. Protagoras answers with the teachings of ancient Greece traditions and myths to justify the fact that he could teach the art of politics. The two then continue discussing the role of virtue in politics and its relationship with power. This is where the opinion of Socrates and Protagoras diverge, because while Protagoras argues that unaware knowledge of virtue can exist, as we have said so far, for Socrates knowledge is awareness, as he loved to repeat the motto of the Oracle of Delphi, know yourself. The virtuous knows what virtue is and how to deal with power facing obstacles. This reconnects to the idea that politics is logos, reason, and hence science, and can be taught as long as it is based on awareness of that science and technique that Protagoras discredited at the start of the dialogue. In the Gorgias, Socrates discusses the essence of politics. Gorgias was a teacher of rhetoric. In the dialogue, one of his students argues that politics is, in essence, the ability to use words to convince people to do whatever you want them to do. Rhetoric is an ability that can be used to do justice and injustice. Of course, this is where Socrates is in opposition with Gorgias' student. In fact, Socrates believes that rhetoric can disguise as politics, but it will never be politics. This is because, as an art of legislation and justice, politics is essentially virtuous and nobody can abuse politics to do injustice. Why? Because Socrates thought that people do not do evil things because they like it, but because they ignore what's good. As you see, knowledge is Socrates' solution to all problems. Yet, Gorgias' student, more cynical and realistic, remains unconvinced of Socrates' standpoint. He believes that rhetoric gives access to power and power can corrupt people, often leading to acts of injustice. Another student intervenes to argue that politics is in fact power, where power manifests as the law of the strongest. Of course, this is contested by Socrates, that reiterates the idea that pleasure and the self-satisfaction of those in power are illusionary good expressed by men who do not know what the real good is. The dialogue finally concludes with a critique of the policies of Athens after the death of Pericles, caused by a moral decline of the citizenry. In the Crito, the dialogue in which Socrates participates right before his death, the philosopher expresses another relevant idea, the importance of the law. According to Socrates, laws are above everybody, including the opinion of the assembly and rulers. In this idea of morality, relatively new and innovative for the Athens of that time, Socrates thought that the law, as a symptom of the universal, was above the particular. Of course, this is a fundamental element of the philosophy of Plato. Socrates' critique focuses again on rhetoric as the art of deception, contesting the idea that decisions are determined by the majority. In fact, Socrates believes that a decision is correct only as long as it is rational. Laws, not the decisions of majorities, are the only thing to which a citizen should bend. In the dialogue, Socrates explains that laws protect, educate the person, guarantees freedom and property. When a man becomes an adult, he can move to the city where he likes laws the most, and therefore there is an unwritten pact that should be always respected between a citizen and laws. Yet, Socrates clarifies that laws are never perfect and should be always improved through time, experience, and growing knowledge. The dialogue concludes with Socrates committing suicide by drinking poison, respecting the law, even if the death sentence was enforced by a tribunal that took an irrational decision. In the end, Socrates proved the faith to his ideas of morality not with words, but through his life example. The lecture is over. Thank you for watching. While Socrates' ideas are to some extent naive, one important teaching that he offers is that decisions of majorities are not always correct, and that we should aspire at incompetent politicians rather than convincing ones, or worse, incompetent people with good rhetorical art. It is hence important to learn to see through lies and be guided by rationality to improve our democracies.